The story of Burkinas, a young leader's dream for a free Africa. There was a time, not so long ago in the grand timeline of human history, when a map of Africa looked very different. It was not yet sliced into neat lines and colored blocks, claimed by flags that flew oceans away. It was a land of kingdoms and caliphates, of diverse peoples who thrived in their own rhythms, trading across deserts, cultivating lush valleys, and preserving knowledge in ancient manuscripts. Africa was not sleeping, nor silent. It was alive. But across the seas, in the drawing rooms of Europe, another rhythm beat, one driven by the hunger for land, gold, spices, and power. As the 19th century drew to a close, the great European powers met in Berlin in 1884 to settle their rivalry not through war on their own soil, but by dividing a continent that was never theirs to divide. No African ruler received an invitation. No tribal chief had a voice. In a matter of months, lines were drawn through deserts and rainforests alike. Kingdoms were split. Tribes were merged. Cultures were overwritten with ink on paper. What followed was a storm of flags, languages, and foreign customs. French in West Africa, English in the East, Portuguese and German in the South. Africa's rich soil, teeming with minerals, oil, and precious stones, became the prize in a new kind of war. One fought not with swords, but contracts, ports, and forced labor. Entire societies were restructured. Traditional leaders were replaced or manipulated. Men were taken to dig mines or harvest rubber. Women and children were separated. Villages relocated. What had once been a land of abundance became a network of outposts for European wealth. The riches of the Congo River, the gold of the Ashanti, the diamonds of South Africa, all of it flowed outward, enriching cities like Paris and London, while the lands from which they came grew poorer. Yet even in the face of this massive transformation, the soul of Africa remained unbroken. Stories were still told by firelight. Resistance whispered through hidden drumbeats. Pride clung to the people like the dust of the savannah. And though it would take generations, a question began to rise like the morning sun. When will we own ourselves again? That question would travel across time, through war and revolution, until it reached the ears of a new generation, one that would carry Africa's hopes into the modern age. By the time the guns of World War II fell silent, something had shifted not just in Europe, but in Africa too. The war had exhausted the old empires. France, Britain, Belgium, once untouchable, had bled resources and morale on battlefields far from home. And in the shadows of that great conflict, millions of African soldiers who had fought under foreign flags began to ask a simple question: why should we fight for freedom abroad when we do not have it at home? The drums of independence began to sound louder. It started as a whisper in the streets of Accra, Dakar, Bamako. Then it became marches, boycotts, student protests. From Cairo to Cape Town, the continent was waking up. And in 1960, a year historians would come to call the Year of Africa, 17 African nations declared independence. Flags that had flown over colonial posts were lowered. New colors, new hopes, new anthems rose in their place. But freedom, as the old saying goes, is more than the absence of chains. And for many African nations, what came next wasn't true liberation, it was a carefully arranged illusion. Take the case of West Africa. Though colonial governors were gone, their systems remained. The French, for example, had devised a way to keep control without appearing to. They offered independence while maintaining the CFA franc, a currency still tied to the French treasury. Military bases remained. Agreements were signed that favored former colonizers, and new leaders were often trained, advised, or quietly approved by European powers. It was empire by another name, a velvet glove over the same iron fist. In boardrooms in Paris and London, decisions were still being made about who would mine Africa's gold, who would drill her oil, and who would build her roads. Contracts were signed that gave away vast resources for pennies. And when African leaders dared to speak up when they demanded more, when they asked to control their own futures, they were often met with resistance, sabotage, or worse. But even in the face of manipulation, the fire that had been lit could not be extinguished. A new wave of African thinkers, dreamers, and warriors emerged, leaders with names like Sékou Touré, Patrice Lumumba, Kwame Nkrumah, and Thomas Sankara, men who believed in a different Africa. An Africa that would speak in its own voice, grow its own food, build its own schools, and shape its own destiny. They were not perfect, but they were bold. And as the winds of the Cold War swept across the continent, their boldness would be tested. Because Africa, rich in resources and strategic in location, had become the newest prize in a global game between East and West, what followed was a new kind of struggle, not just between African nations and their former rulers, but between the ideals of self-reliance and the seductive pull of foreign aid, investment, and intervention. Still, the question that once echoed from village to village remained alive. When will we truly be free? And soon, that question would find new urgency in the voices of those willing to die for the answer. Freedom has always had a cost. For those bold enough to chase it, especially in a world shaped by power, profit, and politics, liberation rarely comes without sacrifice. And for Africa's new generation of revolutionary leaders, that price would be paid in full. One of those voices belonged to Thomas Sankara, the young, charismatic president of a small West African nation. In the early 1980s, he took the reins of a country burdened by poverty, corruption, and dependency, and renamed it Burkina Faso, meaning Land of Upright People. But it wasn't just the name that changed. Overnight, Sankara rejected luxury government cars, slashed his own salary, and sold off the presidential fleet. He wore simple clothes, rode a bicycle, and told his people, "We must produce what we consume, and consume what we produce." He banned foreign aid that came with strings. He nationalized land and resources. He empowered women, planted trees against desertification, built schools and hospitals, all in just 4 years. And for that, he became a symbol of pride across the continent. But symbols have power, and in a world where profit and control speak louder than justice, such power made Sankara dangerous. In 1987, he was assassinated in a coup, his vision silenced, but not erased. His story was a warning. The world often fears a free Africa. Years later, another leader would rise from the deserts of North Africa, Muammar Gaddafi of Libya. Love him or hate him, Gaddafi's ambitions for Africa were monumental. He dreamed of a United States of Africa, complete with a single passport, one military, and a shared currency backed by gold, not dollars or euros. He poured money into African development, hosted continental summits, and challenged foreign influence in African banking and trade. But in 2011, after years of tension with global powers, his reign ended in violence. A foreign military campaign toppled his government, and he was killed in the chaos. Libya, a once stable nation, fell into years of fragmentation. 2 leaders, 2 dreams, 2 brutal ends, and yet their stories did not vanish. Instead, they planted seeds. Young Africans watched. They listened. They learned. They saw how those who sought to reclaim Africa's wealth were vilified, how those who challenged foreign control were labeled threats. But they also saw something else, the courage to try. Because beneath every headline, every speech, and every assassination, one truth remained. Africa's future could not be outsourced. It had to be written by Africans, for Africans. And in the years that followed, a new chapter would begin, one not led by politicians in suits, but by a new kind of leader, one forged not in the halls of diplomacy, but in the fire of rebellion. A leader who would rise not just to lead a country, but to revive a spirit buried for too long. His name was Ibrahim, and his story was only just beginning. In a time when many African leaders wore fine suits, delivered scripted speeches, and quietly preserved the systems they inherited, Ibrahim was different. He was not raised in palaces or foreign universities. His roots were deep in the red soil of his homeland. He grew up not with privilege, but with purpose, watching farmers toil while foreign trucks rolled past, carrying gold, cotton, and cobalt away from villages that had no clean water. He was a soldier by training, but a visionary by instinct. And as he rose through the ranks, he began to see with sharp clarity his country was free in name only. The people spoke of independence, yet foreign corporations held the mining rights. The cities flew national flags, yet foreign militaries still patrolled the skies. Aid money arrived, but so did contracts, conditions, and advisors who seemed more interested in profits than people. To Ibrahim, this wasn't sovereignty. It was a new kind of occupation, softer, subtler, but no less real. Then came a breaking point. A convoy of foreign vehicles moved through a village near the mines guarded by soldiers who did not speak the local language. Children stared. Elders turned away. Whispers spread. Who truly rules this land? That image haunted Ibrahim. He returned to the capital with questions. But instead of answers, he found more silence, more backroom deals, more excuses, more officials who shrugged and said, "That's just the way it is." So he decided to change it. With quiet resolve and growing support from young officers and civilians alike, he stepped forward not with speeches, but with action. A sudden shift in power occurred. The old order was replaced. The world watched in disbelief as this young leader, barely in his mid-30s, stood before the nation not as a ruler for personal glory, but as a caretaker of a buried dream. He spoke simply, "We must reclaim our dignity. We must own what is beneath our soil, what flows in our rivers, and what grows from our land. We must choose the path not of dependency, but of destiny." And people listened. Farmers, students, nurses, miners, those who had long been forgotten heard something new in his voice. Not blame, not slogans, but belief. A belief that Africa could rise on its own terms, not as a shadow of someone else's model. Ibrahim didn't promise quick miracles. What he offered was honesty and effort, and that, for many, was more powerful than money. He began auditing contracts, reviewing mining agreements, visiting rural towns without escorts. The foreign press called him defiant. Locals called him our brother. Yet even as hope bloomed, clouds gathered. Powerful interests, both inside and outside the continent, watched his moves with concern. For them, a leader who prioritized local ownership and refused dependency was not just unusual. He was a threat to the order they had carefully built. But Ibrahim remained calm, grounded, determined. He often quoted the elders, "Even a river starts as a small spring." And for Africa, perhaps, this spring had finally begun to flow. Ibrahim believed that true independence begins underground. For decades, foreign corporations had drilled, blasted, and dug their way through African soil, hauling out gold, manganese, uranium, and rare earth minerals. And yet, the schools remained underfunded, hospitals lacked medicine, villages had no running water. To Ibrahim, this wasn't just unfair, it was unsustainable. So he made a bold move. He began to review and revoke mining licenses. Any company that had signed an exploitative deal, one that gave 90% of profits to shareholders overseas while leaving behind dusty roads and broken promises, was given a simple choice: renegotiate or leave. The announcement shook boardrooms from Paris to Toronto. To the outside world, it looked like rebellion, but to the people, it felt like justice. For the first time, communities living near the mines were invited to public town halls. Elders were asked for input. Young engineers, educated abroad and often ignored at home, were hired to design new extraction models that focused on long-term national benefit, not short-term foreign gains. Ibrahim didn't stop there. He directed his administration to create a sovereign mineral fund, a kind of national savings account where a portion of all profits from gold and other exports would be deposited. These funds would be reinvested into schools, clinics, and renewable energy. Not a single cent would be funneled through foreign intermediaries. "We cannot beg for what is ours," he said in a televised address. "From this soil, our ancestors rose. From this soil, our children must rise too." Of course, this shift didn't come quietly. Foreign newspapers began printing skeptical headlines. International banks warned of instability. Diplomatic cables flew fast, with veiled threats about aid reductions and investment freezes. But the people held firm. They had seen enough of stability that left them hungry, and something remarkable began to happen. For the first time in a generation, young people started returning from abroad. Engineers, doctors, designers, even artists, drawn by a new sense of purpose. Not everyone agreed with every decision Ibrahim made, but almost everyone agreed he was fighting for something real. In the countryside, farmers were encouraged to form cooperatives, processing their own cotton and cashews before exporting them. In the cities, entrepreneurs were offered incentives to launch tech startups that solved local problems, not imported ones. And across the nation, new roads and solar grids began appearing not as charity, but as investments made possible by reclaiming the land beneath their feet. Still, Ibrahim knew this was just the beginning. Turning a nation around was like turning a river upstream. It takes time, patience, and pain. But something had changed. People no longer waited for help to come from outside. They began looking to each other and to the land that had always been theirs. Because in the end, as Ibrahim often said, Africa's wealth was never a curse. It was simply mismanaged. With every speech Ibrahim gave, and every mine he reclaimed, something began to stir beyond the borders of his homeland. Not in the villages or cities of Africa, but in faraway capitals where polished diplomats whispered in hallways and think tanks drafted quiet memos. They were watching, and they were worried. For decades, the arrangement had been simple. Africa would export its resources, and in return, it would import solutions from foreign advisors, foreign aid, foreign armies. A circle of dependency had been drawn, so neat and silent that many forgot it was never designed to be broken. But now, Ibrahim was doing just that. He wasn't burning bridges, he was building a different road. And that made some people uncomfortable. Foreign media began to shift their tone. Articles once curious or respectful turned critical. Headlines painted him as a populist, a strongman, a danger to democracy. Think tanks released reports warning that instability was growing in the region, though people at home saw schools being repaired and roads being paved. It wasn't just the media. More subtle tactics began to emerge. Currency pressure, foreign contractors quietly canceling deals, rumors swirling of embargoes or sanctions. Offers wrapped in diplomacy, but designed to corner and control. And then, the digital war. Suddenly, anonymous accounts flooded social media, spreading fear. They claimed inflation was rising. They said the new government was corrupt. They warned of collapse, chaos, and coup. But the people had lived through real chaos before, and they could tell the difference between a crisis and a smear campaign. Ibrahim did not lash out. He did not point fingers. Instead, he launched a transparency platform, an open access system where every citizen could see where national funds were going. Mining profits, public projects, government salaries, all made visible. "You don't fight lies with louder lies," he said calmly. "You fight them with light." This strategy shocked his critics. Instead of hiding, he invited oversight. International observers, local journalists, student unions, all were given access. The result? Trust grew. Even as international voices grew louder in condemnation, local voices grew firmer in support. Ibrahim also began to host regional gatherings, not flashy summits, but quiet meetings with leaders from nearby countries who were also tired of being told what to do. They met not to denounce others, but to imagine something new, a future designed by Africans, for Africans. In one meeting, a young leader asked him, "How do we resist pressure from those more powerful?" Ibrahim smiled and replied, "By knowing what you stand for, before they try to buy it." These weren't easy days. Mistakes were made. Progress was slow, but something powerful was happening. The people no longer looked at global powers with awe or fear. They looked at each other with belief. And that, more than any resource or alliance, was the beginning of true strength. It started with whispers conversations in university dorms, late-night discussions in radio booths, small gatherings in village squares. But soon, those whispers grew into voices, and the voices into movements. What had begun as a single nation reclaiming its future began to echo across a continent. From Dakar to Dar es Salaam, Lusaka to Lagos, young people began asking the same question. If they can do it, why can't we? The world often painted Africa as a continent of crisis, conflict, hunger, disease. But within Africa, a new narrative was forming, one of vision, value, and vitality. And at its center stood a philosophy that Ibrahim had never copyrighted, trademarked, or forced, but had lived: dignity, sovereignty, accountability. African nations, long treated as dependent clients of foreign aid, began rethinking old contracts and dusty agreements. Ministers in multiple countries began renegotiating mining rights. Student unions called for investment in local agriculture over imported grain. Journalists uncovered decades-old deals that had funneled billions abroad. The ripple effect had begun. And with it came something even rarer than reform: solidarity. For the first time in decades, leaders from different regions started meeting not as competitors for loans or headlines, but as collaborators. They exchanged ideas, shared engineers, pooled resources. Pan-African forums began to flourish again, not as symbolic events, but as engines of shared strategy. Even in countries where skepticism remained, something had changed. The fear of speaking truth was no longer absolute. The idea that Africa had to ask permission to prosper was being openly challenged. Across the continent, local radio stations began featuring youth voices. Market vendors discussed policy over mangoes. Artists painted murals of not just leaders, but farmers, scientists, and mothers as symbols of change. Revolution was no longer about protest, it was about construction. Meanwhile, back home, Ibrahim watched all of this unfold with humility. He never claimed credit. He reminded his people that this wasn't about him. "This is not the age of saviors," he said in a national broadcast. "It is the age of servants, those who build, not boast." Of course, not everyone joined this wave. There were still setbacks. Some governments clung to old ways. Others feared retaliation from powerful allies abroad. But even there, something subtle was shifting. A questioning, a hesitation, a sense that the tide might be turning. Even global powers began to notice. Some softened their rhetoric. Others extended quiet invitations for dialogue. The narrative of Africa as a passive recipient was being rewritten not with anger, but with evidence. Evidence of new roads paved with local funds, of hospitals built from mining revenues, of students studying coding instead of fleeing overseas. Africa wasn't rising. Africa was returning to itself, to its people, to a dream long deferred. And though the fire had begun quietly, it now burned with calm certainty across the continent. Leadership, for all its speeches and ceremonies, is often a lonely road. Behind the crowds and the praise, Ibrahim Trrowé carried a truth few could see. Hope is heavy. At night, when the cameras were off and the chants faded into silence, he would sit alone with reports, letters, and maps, figuring out how to stretch limited resources across unlimited needs. Every village without water felt like a personal failure. Every school still using broken desks tugged at him like an open wound. He was hailed as a symbol, but he never asked to be one. "I'm not a miracle," he once whispered to an aide. "Just a man trying to do right with what little time I've got." Even as victories grew, more clinics, more clean water, more people believing again, Ibrahim never let triumph turn into arrogance. He knew that one mistake could unravel it all. And so he worked like a farmer at the start of a storm. Fast, steady, and with no illusion of control. Some nights, he dreamt of the past, his time as a young officer. Idealistic and unseen. He remembered when he first raised his voice in protest, not knowing if anyone would listen. And now, that voice had become a beacon, not just for his country, but for millions across a continent. But the light brought shadows too. He faced betrayals. Some former allies, intoxicated by their own power, turned bitter when asked to follow new rules. Whispers of corruption and foreign bribes reached his ears. The old elite, once silent, began regrouping. They did not fight openly, but they waited. For his fatigue, for a wrong move. Even his health, once a source of quiet strength, began to falter. Exhaustion weighed on his body. Doctors warned him to rest. But how could he? "How do you sleep?" he asked one night, "when your people have waited for generations just to wake up?" His family saw it. His closest friends worried. Yet they also understood. He was not driven by ego or pride. He was driven by urgency. A belief that history had opened a door, and it might not stay open forever. Still, Ibrahim never let the public see his doubt. He smiled. He showed up. He listened more than he spoke. Because he knew that while leaders make laws, it is the people who make legacies. And through it all, he held to a simple idea, that dignity is not delivered from above. It is built, brick by brick, from below. In private, he wrote letters, some to his children, some to future leaders he might never meet. In them, he poured out everything he couldn't say aloud, his fears, his regrets, his belief that even if he failed, others would continue. Because this dream didn't belong to him. It belonged to the child in a remote village who no longer had to walk 5 miles for clean water, to the mother who could now give birth in a lit hospital, to the teacher who no longer had to rewrite the same chalkboard lesson because the students finally had books, and most of all, It belonged to the continent, to a people rediscovering that they were never weak, only held back. It began with an invitation. A major international conference, hosted in a towering glass hall overlooking the Geneva lake, designed to reimagine development for the global south. Leaders from around the world would gather with translators, handshakes, and carefully scripted speeches. President Ibrahim Trrowé wasn't particularly fond of such summits. Too much symbolism, too little truth. But this one felt different. For the first time, he was being asked not just to attend, but to speak. The room was filled with polished suits, high-speed internet, and agendas that whispered of progress. Yet as Trrowé looked out across the hall, he saw something else. History, still unfinished, sitting in every chair. When he stood to speak, there was no fire in his tone, only clarity. He didn't condemn, he didn't accuse. Instead, he told a story. Of a boy who once studied under a mango tree because there were no classrooms. Of a grandmother who sold peanuts to feed 5 grandchildren. Of a nation once overlooked that now exported clean energy and textbooks. He spoke of dignity not as a demand, but as a shared human right. And then he said something that made the room fall still. Africa doesn't ask for favors. We ask for fairness. Not aid that returns to its donor in interest, but partnerships that leave both sides stronger. The silence that followed was not discomfort, it was recognition. The kind of silence that comes when someone finally says what everyone else has tiptoed around for years. The speech spread. News outlets replayed it. Social media lit up. For a moment, the world listened, not out of guilt, but respect. But not everyone applauded. Behind closed doors, old structures began to stir. Some investors whispered about instability. Certain trade officials began raising compliance concerns. There were warnings cloaked in policy papers, reminders that ambition must still obey old frameworks. At home, Trrowé returned to growing pressures. Climate challenges threatened crops. A key infrastructure deal stalled, and international NGOs quietly withdrew from programs they once championed. Some called it coincidence. Others called it pressure. But the people? They stood firm. Teachers continued teaching. Farmers planted with renewed purpose. Young entrepreneurs opened digital hubs in rural areas. Trrowé's belief that dignity could outlast dependency was beginning to root deeply. In one village, a girl named Asata stood in front of a new solar-powered library. When asked what she wanted to be, she said, "President, like Ibrahim." That moment, more than any applause in Geneva, became his quiet triumph, because what he had built wasn't just policy, it was belief. Years had passed. The streets of Burkina Faso were no longer the same. Where once dust and silence reigned, now there were paved roads, humming markets, and the laughter of children echoing from solar-lit schools. President Ibrahim Trrowé no longer stood on every billboard. His image had faded from the giant murals once painted in celebration. But his presence, his spirit, was everywhere. He had served his term with humility. And when it ended, he stepped down not out of fatigue, but out of faith. Faith in the people he had awakened. Faith that the mission was never about him, but about a dream bigger than any single name. They called it the Burkina Faso miracle. Not because the country suddenly became wealthy. It didn't. Not because every challenge was solved. They weren't. But because something even rarer happened. The people began to believe in themselves. In villages, community councils replaced foreign-funded NGOs. In cities, young engineers coded apps in local languages. Former migrants returned not out of necessity, but pride to build the future they once thought they'd find elsewhere. Children now studied their own history, not through foreign textbooks, but stories told by their own grandparents, stories of courage, survival, and now, revival. And Ibrahim, he disappeared quietly into the countryside. No palace, no statue, just a small home near a river where he grew oranges, read poetry, and occasionally mentored the next generation. Every so often, visitors would find him walking alone through the fields. And if asked what he thought of his legacy, he would simply say, "If I did anything worth remembering, you won't need me to remind you." In time, Burkina Faso joined a growing regional alliance, built not on fear, but on shared futures. Trade routes were opened, research centers established, health networks linked, and slowly, The continent once carved and divided by strangers began stitching itself back together on its own terms. Across the world, observers noted the shift. Some analysts called it a realignment. Others, a silent revolution. But for the people of Burkina Faso, it wasn't theory. It was daily life. And when the young president who succeeded Trrowé stood before the new Pan-African Parliament and quoted him, the chamber rose in applause. "We are not what they said we were. We are what we choose to become." In the end, the story of Ibrahim Trrowé wasn't about resistance. It was about restoration, of voice, of dignity, of possibility. And like a flame passed gently from one hand to another, his light lived on, not in marble or metals, but in the courage of those who kept going, long after the cameras were gone. A story that began with silence ended with a chorus. Africa, long written about by others, had finally picked up the pen and begun writing for herself.